Thank you. All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Sorry for the delays and technical issues. Thank you to Jeremy Lassen for resolving them. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tils Mishpacha Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this year. And there's Chus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Haba Aleinu L'Tova, Benny Goldberg for Aliyah for the Neshama of his parents, Avram ben Asher Pinchas, Fegar Ezel Bas Zelig, and in the hopes that all the tefillos of Klal Yisrael and those here in the Shul Baruch Hashem will be answered. Shmuley and Lieber Dinowitz, Le'ili Nishmas, Rav Ari Flum, David Flum's father, Rav Yitzchak Aryeh ben Achav, Rabbi Yaakov Zichrono Livracha, and our week of learning sponsors, David Goodman, Le'ili Nishmas, Roi ben Aryeh Zichrono Livracha. We hope to, in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all the Neshama Sav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah, should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should Emir Hashem bring home our hostages. B'shalom and b'karov, allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yedehem, and indeed see a month and a year ahead of Besoros Tovos Klal Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. Shechianu v'kimanu v'giyanu, that we are Zochem Eretz Hashem to close out Meseches Avoda Zara. Very exciting. Today's daf is Ayin Vav 76. We are picking up Eretz Hashem on Ayin Hey Amud Beis 75b. 75b, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Zaban Mana de Marda, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from before it gets wide. I thought I was going to say from the bottom. Right? From before it gets wide. All right, we got this. Let's go. Says Gemara, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Zaban de Marda me Ovik Kochavim. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef bought a utensil called the Marda utensil. Rashi points out over here that this Marda utensil was made of earth and manure, hardened together, made into utensil, and he was going to tovel it. No, you only have to immerse metal. So again, this type of utensil, which was made out of earthenware and manure, does not need to be immersed in the mikvah. Amar Rav Ashi. And I will say that is, by the way, just a ton of halacha l'maisa. That a lot of so far everything we're seeing in this sugya is all halacha l'maisa. Next interesting sugya. Amar Rav Ashi. Hani klis chulkis. What about glass? What is the status of glass? Now, remember, again, this is a dual question, both in terms of kashering as well as in terms of tvila, immersion. So, so this is very interesting. The Gemara says glass is treated like metal. Why is glass treated like metal? Because glass, if it breaks, you can melt it down and reform it just like metal. Therefore, it has the status of metal utensils. So both say, so obviously for the Gemara, it sounds like so Pashat, we know that in halacha, this is a very big machlokes. What is the status of glass? Both in terms of does glass absorb, not absorb, but here, really the question is not as much in terms of absorbency, but rather, again, tvila. Do you have to immerse glass in a mikvah prior to use? So how do we paskin? We paskin yes, but interestingly enough, without a bracha. So we do immerse glass in a mikvah, but no bracha, which is why generally if you're going to take glass to the mikvah, always good to take it along with a metal utensil. That's why we make the bracha on the metal, and ultimately, again, devolves upon everything else. Interesting halacha. Kunya. Now, both say kunya is fascinating. What's kunya? So Rashi says over here, Tchilaso shel cheres v'chofen oso b'chofya shel aver v'tashmisha deitzonin. So clay kunya is an earthenware utensil that is covered with, aver is literally lead, but it means metal. So at its base, it's an earthenware utensil covered with metal. So now we'll say, what's the shaila? What's the status of the utensil? On one hand, at its base is earthenware, no tvila. On the other hand, it's covered with metal, which requires tvila. What's the status of such a utensil? So the Gemara says, Pligi barav achav ravina, chadamart kitchilasa v'chadamart kisofo. One says we judge the utensil after its beginning, so therefore that's an earthenware utensil. And one says, no, we look at it after its end. Ultimately, that it's a metal utensil. Look at the coating. The hilchasa kisofo. And ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, we judge it ultimately, again, like its end. Therefore, it's considered to be like a metal utensil. We look at the coating, and the coating essentially determines the identity of the kli. I will say, just to understand, this fascinating child, where does this come up? Fascinatingly enough, glazed china. Glazed china. The glaze is actually glass. Glass. China, of course, is earthenware. Does one have to tovel glazed china or not? So it's big machlokes. It's big machlokes. Is it called china, earthenware, therefore it doesn't require tefillah? Or no? Ultimately, again, it's glass, and therefore halacha l'maisa again does require tefillah. All right, consult your local Orthodox rabbi for that. The Gemara says so. It happens to just also, by the way, again. We don't have enough time for this. We have to go through this as well. But interestingly enough, there's a little bit of machlokes Rashi Tosis over here. Exactly what is the definition of klei kunya? This is also sugya in chulin. But again, just so you understand, that's the sensitivity. Do we look at the kli based on what it is at its core, or do we look at the kli based on its coating? That's the fundamental machlokes. Ibay lahu. The Gemara then asks another kasha. Mashkanta mai. Very interesting. What happens if you have a utensil as collateral? Right? I have a utensil of a non-Jew given to me as collateral. Now, both say, interestingly enough, it depends on the arrangement, but very often it was common that the lender had the right to use the collateral. So let's say, for example, again, I lent money to Akum. Akum gave me a kli as collateral, so I have a right to use it. But what's the shaila? The shaila doesn't require tefillah, doesn't require immersion in the mikvah prior to my usage. So Amar Rav Ashi, we'll say first white line. Amar Rav Ashi, Amar Rav Ashi, Abon mashkin le'oviko chavim kasa de kasba va'at b'lei v'ishtibe. So this is very interesting. So Amar Rav Ashi said one time, so my father lent money to an akum. The akum gave him a silver utensil, and father first immersed it before he used it. Now, interesting enough, Amar Rav Ashi says, v'lo yadana, and what I don't know is, imishum de kasara mashkanta kizvini damya, imishum de chazi la'ove gochavim de daiti l'shakuye. Say, I know my father immersed it before he used it, but I don't know why he did that. Did he do that because he felt that something collateralized is like a sale, and therefore my father felt that he was the owner of this object? Or was it because he thought that most probably the akum was not going to repay the debt? So because he wasn't going to repay the debt, therefore, again, what was my father going to take as payment? Ultimately, again, the collateral. And that's why he went ahead and essentially owned this. So I know my father immersed it before he used it, but I'm not exactly sure why. Okay. So we'll say, so now we get into the kishkas, a little bit of the halal. So that was much more tevilas kilim, right? Immersion in the mikvah. Now we're jumping back a little bit more to kashering. So it says the Gemara, if one goes ahead and takes utensils, purchases utensils from an akum, so dvarim shlo nishtamish bahen matbilan veheim tehorin. So if it was an item that was never used with heat, so you have a utensil that was never used with heat, right? So what do you need to do? Just immerse it in the mikvah, and you're good to go. That's all. Dvarim shlo nishtamish bahen aydeit sonein kigon koses kitonios sluchos madichin umatbilan veheim tehorin. If it's items ultimately again that were so again I should say differently. Category 1 is items that were never used. So I purchased something from an akum new. What do you have to do with that? Immerse it in a mikvah, and you're good to go. Second category, items used cold. I don't know, you bought drinking glasses from the akum, never used with any kind of heat. Halacha l'maisa, what do you need to do? Clean it off, wipe it down, immerse it in a mikvah. But let's say you bought utensils that were used with heat. Kigon, hayoros, v'hakum kumusun, umechamechamin, magilan umatbilan veheim tehorin. Anything used with heat, and in this case, we're assuming heat means liquid. In other words, let's say it was used with water, and liquid, or it was used for cooking. But again, there was a liquid medium. Ultimately, again, if it was used with a liquid medium and heat, then kashering is hagala, boiling water. We're going to see how exactly hagala is accomplished in just a little bit. Or any items used with fire. For example, kigon, hashipudina, askalos, right? Spit, skewers, melabnon, umapil vein torin. You kasher with fire. Suppose I 4 categories. New utensils, all they require is tvila. Utensils that were only used cold, ultimately wash it off, right? Clean it off to mikvah. Items that were used with heat, but with a liquid medium, hagala, boiling water. Items used with heat, direct fire, ultimately, again, what we call what we call libun, going ahead and kashering with fire. Incredible. The Gemara says, so interestingly enough, what happens if you went ahead and you bought a utensil from an akum and you did not kasher it, right? You didn't kasher it. What's the status of the food that you cooked in it? One opinion says that the food cooked inside of it is aser. The other opinion said mutter. It's not a contradiction. Lo kasha, hakiman damer no seitam lefgam aser, hakiman damer no seitam lefgam mutter. Okay, so what says the previous machlokes we saw? The assumption is that any of the absorptions in the pot ultimately, again, are blunted, right? Are not, they're much more dormant. So the shaila is, what's the impact of those dormant absorptions when they come out and get mixed in with my kosher food? So one opinion says, no seitam lefgam is mutter. One says, aser. Well, the mandamer no seitam lefgam mutter. Gilu of de kochavim da aser achmana hechi mishkachas la. But one second, if you hold no seitam lefgam, if you hold that no seitam lefgam is mutter, so then how do you ever have a prohibited situation of using the utensil of a non-Jew? In other words, if you say that in general the absorptions that come out of the pot are not really value added, so then what's the case in the Torah about using the utensils of a non-Jew that would be prohibited? So the Gemara says, you're right. In general, the Torah is only answering a kedera bas yoma. Now, both sides, bas yoma means a utensil used within the last 24 hours. The assumption is within the last 24 hours, the absorptions are active. That's the biblical prohibition case. Anything past 24 hours is only going to be rabbinically prohibited. Mikan ve'elech lishteri. So if that's the case, the only time you should be unable to use the utensil of a non-Jew is when? Within 24 hours of his last use. But after 24 hours, it should be fine. The Gemara says, technically, you're right. But gezerah kedera she'ena bas yoma, mishum kedera bas yoma. What are we concerned about? We're concerned that if we let you use the utensil of a non-Jew 24 hours after his last use, you'll come to what? Use it within 24 hours of his last use. Incredible. So we'll say that is incredibly important, and this detail is very important. Absorptions within 24 hours of use are active. After 24 hours of use are dormant. This has a variety of kashrus ramifications and implications. V'idach kedera bas yomi nama mifka pagama. The other opinion will say the truth is even absorptions within 24 hours, still it's not like the actual flavor itself. Ultimately, again, it is still considered to be somewhat what we'll call pogum, still a little bit compromised in some way. The Gemara goes weiter. From the Rav Amram Rav Sheshes. So this is incredible. So Rav Amram raised the following issue to Rav Sheshes. Tanan, we learned Hashipudin va'askala melabnan bar. Ultimately, again, I will say, so this is spits, skewers. How do you kasher it? Fire. Direct, in other words, literally you take a flame to it. Va'tanya gavek hadshim. But I will say, interestingly enough, if you contrast this with sacrificial law, and I will say, interestingly enough, there's a whole set of halachas about kashering utensils that were used with karbanos. Why? What's the issue by karbanos? Because remember, interestingly enough, a carbon has a window for consumption. Bless you. What's the status of the carbon after that window has closed? What is it called? What is it called? Nosar. Interestingly enough, the nosar designation applies to absorptions as well, which is quite fascinating. So therefore, you have to be careful about kashering utensils used. You have to be careful about kashering utensils used for kachim. So listen to this. By kachim, by karbanos, hashipod va'askala. So if you have a spit or a skewer ultimately used for kachim, magilan bechamin, you go ahead and you kasher it with hot water. So I'll say, interesting. We just said before that skewers and spits, which are used in direct contact with fire, how do you kasher it? With fire. Here it sounds like hagala. Hagala is the process of boiling water, which again we'll discuss in greater depth in just a moment. Why are you comparing karbanas, ultimately again, to utensils purchased from non-Jews? It's two different things. And I both say, watch this. Haha, heterabala, hasam isurabala. This is a profound distinction. By an akum, the absorptions are absorptions of isser, absorptions of prohibition. That's treated one way. By karbanos, the absorptions ultimately, again, are permitted. So what says we're going to see, this is a theme. whenever the absorptions ultimately, again, are of a permitted source, the kashering process ultimately is going to be more lenient. When the absorptions are from a prohibited source, you need a stricter form of kosherization. Amar Rava says as follows, sof, ki kapalat isura kapalat. Well, again, that's fine. I understand by kachim, when the absorptions went in, they're mutter. But when they come out, in other words, which means is the longer they stay and they become nosar, then they become asar. Amarava my hagala. So what does it mean when we say that we do hagala by kachim? The Gemara says shtifa umarika. That also refers to the process of scrubbing and washing. And I both say, by the way, good news, because Emeretz Hashem, just a little bit after Hariyas, we're going to finish up Seder and Ezekin, and Emeretz Hashem, then we'll get into Kachim, and we'll discuss a lot of these processes, Emeretz Hashem, in greater depth. But again, when it comes to utensils used for sacrificial purposes, halacha l'maisa, again, is a process called mariko ushtifa, which again literally means washing and scrubbing. Amalei Abaye. Abai said, what are you talking about? Marika and shtifa is done with cold water. Hagala is done with boiling water. Ela amra Abaye yagid alav reo. Rather, Abaye says, this lashon of yagid alav reo, it's taken from the pasuk in Eov, literally means its friend will comment on it, which means I will say that sometimes Mishnayically, the Mishnah doesn't write everything explicitly, but expects you to learn out something from a different context and apply it over here. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Yagid alav reo. The idea over here is learn out these two processes of kashering for kachim and kashering for an akum, or for the absorptions of an akum, and learn them out from each other. So whatever applies to one process, ultimately will apply to the other. Now again, that's not going to be true halacha l'maisa. That's just a havamina. So Tana hacha libon v'uadin hagala. So we'll say it says over here you have to do libon and also hagala. Tana hasam hagala v'uadin libon. Amalei Rava says that doesn't make any sense. Ihachi, if that's the case, that literally, again, the processes for kashering for kachim are the same as kashering for utensil from an akum. If that's the case, lisninhu lekulu b'chada, v'lisna chada be'idach achrisi. We should at least at some point lump all of the halachas together, and then again in their individual respective places, you could just focus on one. V'leima yagid alav reo. Then I'll be able to say, oh, whatever applies to one situation applies to the other. Ella Amarava kachim hainu taima kidrav Nachman Amarava baravua the Amar kol yom biyom naase giul lechavero. Rather, Rava says no. The reason by kachim, ultimately, again, that we're not worried about absorption is very interesting, is because the utensils are constantly used. Because the utensils are used, essentially, there's an automatic kosherization process one day to the next. The absorptions of the previous day's karbanos come out in the cooking of the next day. Therefore, essentially, the absorptions themselves never have the opportunity to become nosar. Why? Because since the utensil is constantly being used, whatever was absorbed comes out before it becomes nosar. To which the Gemara says, that's fine. Tinach shlamim. That works well, for example, by shlamim. For example, shlamim. You have 2 days and 1 night for shlamim. So that makes sense. So let's say again, I'm offering a shlamim on Tuesday. So halacha ma'aseh, I have Tuesday and Wednesday, which means that when I go ahead and I use the utensil on Wednesday, the absorptions of shlamim are coming out before they become nosar. That works well for something like shlamim. Elachatos kivun deliyom v'layla misachla. But let's say for chatos, where you only have 1 day and 1 night. By the time you get around, so let's say I offered up a chatos on Tuesday, so I've got Tuesday and Tuesday night. By the time I use the utensil, ultimately again on Wednesday, the Gemara says, when I use it now by the way is Wednesday, the Gemara says, chatos have nosar, ki hadar mevasha balamachar, O shlamim o chatos kapalit nosar dechatas da'idna bechatas o shlamim dilamachar. By the time I go ahead and I use the utensil on Wednesday, the absorptions are already nosar. So the nosar absorptions are coming into the carbon that I'm cooking today. Amri lo tzricha No problem, because when I use it for a chatas on Tuesday, what do I do? It's very interesting. Interesting. So I'll say, so they were makbid that if you use the utensil for a chatas on Tuesday, what would you do afterwards? That same day, use it for a shlamim. That way, again, on Tuesday, the chatas absorptions came out, and now the new absorptions are shlamim absorptions, for which you have 2 days and 1 night. Therefore, the Gemara says, the chatas del machar ushlamim de esmal bahadi hadadi kashalam zmanayu, because this way again, the chatas ultimately again of tomorrow and the shlamim of yesterday mixed together inside of the kli. Father mavashal shlamim del machar. If that's the case, the Gemara says, Ihachi, which is a great idea, a great chap, but here's the issue, Ihachi, Hagala nami lo liboy. If that's the case, then you shouldn't need Hagala. Because remember, again, in this situation, ultimately, again, the absorptions I have are totally permitted absorptions, to which the Gemara says, you're right, Kashya. That is a good point. Rapapa said, high karid, high low karid. So Rapapa says, here's the difference. Absorptions of karbanos versus stam absorptions. Ultimately, again, karid literally means become solidified. If you take a quick look at Rashi, this is in the third line in the wide lines, and second line into the wide lines, and say Papa Amar high card, high low card, the olam bekachim isura palit udikakashi lach nibay libun kimas nisim lo dami dikil of the gochavim id del mavash libu kol shaita miskasha hablia besocho v'nid bekesbo. So we'll say this is very interesting. The Gemara wants to make the following distinction. By the utensils that I purchased from an akum, it's possible that the utensil wasn't used regularly. Because it wasn't used regularly, therefore, the absorptions harden, whatever this means. Because they harden, I need a more rigorous kosherization process. Conversely, by kachim, the utensils were used all of the time. Because of that, the absorptions were, I guess for lack of a better term, loosened. Because they were loosened, therefore, they are more easily extractable. Therefore, the way you kasher ultimately, again, kachim is just simple hagala, boiling water, whereas by the utensils of an akum, let's say again, for a spit or for a skewer, you'll need libun, actual fire. Very interesting distinction. Rav Ashi says no, and that's why I will say again, went through this a little bit quickly because the conclusion is really the same way that we started. Liolim kidam rinan me'akara. So I'll say in reality, now again, I'll say, how do we get into all of this? What was the Gemara's problem? The Gemara said, if I purchase a spit or skewers from an akum, how do I kasher that? Right? Fire, right? Libun. It was used with fire, right? Direct contact with fire, no liquid medium. Therefore, the way you kasher with fire, yet interestingly enough, the Gemara said that if you go ahead and you have skewers that were used for karbanos, how do you kasher it? Hagala, boiling water. The Gemara says, I don't understand why the distinction. Bottom line about say here's the distinction. Hacha isura bala. Rabbi say herein lies the fundamental distinction, which is what is the nature of the absorption? When the initial absorption was an absorption of Isser, you need a more rigorous form of kosherization that matches the exact form of absorption. When, however, the absorption was of something permitted, ultimately, again, even though it later on becomes prohibited, you could suffice with a more lenient form of kosherization. So that's why when I purchase spit or a skewer from an akum, it's absorbing treif. Treif, you need a more rigorous form of kosherization, one that matches absorptions. How did the skewer absorb? How did it absorb? Fire. How are you going to get it out? Fire. By karbanos, it went ahead and it absorbed permitted absorptions. Therefore, you could use the most lenient form of kosherization. What is the most lenient form of kashering? What's the most lenient form? Hagala. We'll say, by the way, we live this all of the time, which is why, for example, if you kasher utensils for Pesach, interestingly enough, technically speaking, you could pretty much use Hagala on many, many things. Why? Because interestingly enough, although we're machmir to do libun by other things, but chametz is heterabala. right? Chametz is a permitted absorption before Pesach, right? It's permitted absorption. Therefore, it allows us to take certain leniencies with kosherization. So I will say, so this is an incredibly important yesod. The Gemara says, so therefore, halacha l'maisa, generally, the kosherization process has to mirror the manner of absorption, right? That's our 4 categories. However, technically speaking, if the kli, the utensil, did absorb something permitted, under certain circumstances, you can go ahead and use a relaxed or more lenient form of kosherization. Incredible. The Gemara says as follows. But here's the problem. Even by Kabbanos, while it's true that the absorption was a permitted absorption, but we said before that when the utensil goes, that when you're extracting the absorptions, they have become prohibited, right? Because now, ultimately, again, they are nosar. The Gemara says that's fine. Lo isi le'isura be'enei. You're right. At the end of the day, however, by the time they become nosar bosai, they're not be'en. Right? They're not tangible. They're intangible absorptions. So even though they do become prohibited, we're dealing with an intangible that was originally permitted, and therefore we can be mekel. So therefore, the Gemara says that if you purchase spits or skewers from an akum, you have to kasher it with libun, with direct contact with fire. But yet, interestingly enough, if you want to kasher the spits or the skewers that were used for sacrificial purposes, hagala, boiling water will suffice. Incredible. Both in general, when you kasher something with fire, right? With fire, ultimately, again, how much, to what degree? Until the outer layer of the metal comes off. Heat it so much the outer layer. Now, if you try this today, it's not going to work. Just like again in Masechet School, the Gemara discusses that when kashering with libun, with metal, you have to allow the metal to heat up until it glows. If you try that on your utensils today, it will not work, right? Because our metal is treated. So this is reflective of untreated metal. Okay, the Kate said Magilon. They both say, how do you do hagala? How do you do hagala? Boiling water. How do you kasher the boiling water? So the Gemara says, Yora ketana b'soch yora gedola. So the easiest way is, take a big pot, boil it up with water. Then take whatever the item is and what? Dip it into the boiling water. Good. That is hagala. Yora gedola mai. But how do you kasher the big pot? In other words, I understand how to kasher smaller things. Take a big pot, boil water in the big pot, and immerse the smaller items in the big pot. What happens if the item that you have to kasher is the big pot itself? What do you do then? Incredible. Gemara says, "My tashma dahu duda dahavi Rav Ukve." So Rav Akavya, sorry. So there was once a big pot that was in the house of Rav Akavya, and I will say ultimately Rav Akavya had to kasher it. So what did he do? This is fascinating. Ahadir lei amud beis ahadir lei gadafna delisha apuma umalyua mayim ba'arsecha. So Rav Akavya did something very interesting. He took dough, we'll say, and he essentially built a lip around the top of the kli. Now, why was he doing that? He wanted to allow the water to overflow the top of the utensil, and again, make sure that it hit the lip. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava said, Man chacham le'me'aver kiyamel. So this is Rav Akavya. What a chacham. What a great idea. Ilav Rav Akavya de Gavra Rabahu. Right? Who could have done this if not for Rav Akavya, right? What a great chap. The Gemara says, Kasavar, because what does Rav Akavya, the boss say, here it is now. By the way, the boss say, this phrase, this is the key to everything in Hilchos Kashrus, or I should say in the halachas of kashering. What Rav Akavya said, Kasavar, Kibolo, Kach, Polto. The way it goes in is the way it comes out. Therefore, Ma bolo b'nitzotzos, af polto b'nitzotzos. Now, both say, this is very interesting. Rav Akavya felt, the lip of a utensil often absorbs. But I will say the lip doesn't necessarily absorb like the rest, right? Because the rest of the utensil is direct contact with the liquid. Often the lip, how does the lip absorb? Because like there's droplets, nitzotzos. It's like sprinkling, like what's the word? Spritzing, right? There's like spritzkeit, that happens around the lip. So Rav Akavya, interestingly enough, Rav Akavya See, when you read this Gemara, you think, oh, this is great because Rav Akavia's things by building the lip, he ensures that the liquid overflows and touches every part of the rim. Interestingly enough, apparently, Rav Akavia was not so concerned about the liquid kind of touching every part of the lip. He just wanted the liquid from the pot to be able to spritz up and at least touch the lip in that way, because that's how the lip initially went ahead and absorbed. And I both say that is how he paskin. Interestingly enough, if you are kashering a pot, so so again, if you kasher a pot, easy to kasher a pot. You take water, don't use the pot for 24 hours. That makes it a non-ben yomo. That way, any absorptions are ultimately again dormant. That's number one. But number two, you do need the kosherization to go along the lip of the pot as well. So generally, what we just do is we just allow the liquid to overflow the pot a little bit. Does make a little bit of a mess, but it's what's necessary in order to accomplish it. Unless, of course, you want to make this dough lip, as Rav Akavi did, but whatever you do not do that for Pesach. Obviously, bad idea for Pesach. Right. But Lamaisa, at least the rendezvous, I don't know, somebody will come up with this, right? A pot lip, I'm sure it exists, right? Some type of pot lip that you could put around the pot, allowing the water to overflow the sides, the lip, but at the same time, again, not creating a major mess. We'll say, but point to remember over here, kibolo kach polto. That phrase, again, in general, in the halachos of kashering, if you ever want to know, well, what mechanism or what manner what mechanism do I need to kasher this utensil? It's very easy. The way it was used is the way it's going to be kasher. Used with fire, kashered with fire. Used with liquid, kashered with liquid. Why? Kibolo kach polto. Ultimately, the way it goes in is the way it comes out. So I will say, by the way, you should just know, this is a tremendous yisod in our personalistic growth as well. Man is compared to a kli. Man is compared to a utensil. So we'll say we have this is our liturgy in Yom Naram is filled with this. Hare'ani lefanecha kichli malei busha uchlima. We say in Shemona Esrei, Moshe, I stand before you like a utensil filled with embarrassment over what I've done. Because like a kli, Rabbi say it's interesting. Like a kli, you cook in a kli, and what happens? Right, you finish cooking, you clean out the kli. You look at that kli from the outside looking in. What does that kli look like? It can even look like new. Rabbi say, but meanwhile, the effects and the history of that cooking are contained in the walls. Man is the same way. At the end of the day, what I do, Rabbi say, sometimes you can't see what I have done on the externality of my kli. Right? The externality looks good, looks pristine, looks pure, but anything and everything I've done is retained within the walls of my personalistic kli. But sometimes we think that because of that, it's contained within the kli, that there's no hope for me, there's no rebounding for me, there's no second chances for me. Just like the kli can be kashered, I can be kashered as well. Whatever is absorbed in here, the negativity, I can get it out. But how do you get it out? Kibolo kach polto. If you want to get out the negative absorptions in yourself, Rabbi, you have to, again, it's not just enough to do a whole bunch of good things. I have to ask myself, how did it get in here? How did it get in here? What did I do in my life? In other words, what were the decisions I made? What were the behaviors that I engaged in order to allow the negative absorptions in? And it's only once I understand the process about how it got in, can I go ahead and figure out how to get it out. You see, the mistake we make with tshuva, Rabosai, is we like to do fun tshuva. What's fun tshuva? You're like, there's no such thing as fun tshuva. Yes, there is. You know what fun tshuva is? Fun tshuva is like, I'm going to take on this, I'm going to take on that, I'm going to learn this, I'm going to do that. It's fun tshuva, it's exciting tshuva, right? We love that. There's only one problem, only one little itty-bitty detail, which is it doesn't actually work. Because the only form of tshuva that actually works is grueling, introspective tshuva, where I got to look inside the pot, I got to see all the schmutz that's been absorbed, and I got to figure out how did it get in there. But you see, we're so scared to do it because we're so scared to just confront ourselves. But what we forget is there's nothing to be afraid of. Because the great news is, whatever came in, I can get out. I can get it all out. But I have to be brave enough to confront the absorptions. I have to be brave enough to confront the accumulated schmutz inside my personalistic pot that for some of us has been accumulating over decades because I've never had the courage to look inward. So instead, what I do is I get new pot accessories, right? I take on this, I put on a new lid, I got some silver polish, and everything looks great, except I haven't confronted. We're so scared to confront because we think that when we see what's damaged inside, there's no hope for bettering ourselves, but that's not the case. Kibolo, kach polto. Whatever I put in, I could get out, but I first have to figure out how it got in there. Then I have to figure out all of the broken behaviors, approaches, lifestyles that allowed the schmutz to come in, and then in Miras Hashem, I will be able to find a way to extract it. Incredible. I will say, let's go. End of Masechah Sanhedrin. I think my thing just died. Okay, the Satan is clearly trying to derail the end of Avoda Zara. See, he wants us to stay in Avoda Zara. This is what happens over here. All right. In any event, good, I'm just going to, I don't know. All right, it's pulling. You just entangled that for me. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, let's go back to a second. So a knife, how do you go ahead? How do you go ahead and kasher a knife? So the Gemara says you rub it down and it's tar. What do you do ultimately? The Rebbe says it's fascinating. What do you do with the knife? You plunge it 10 times into the ground. Virgin soil, hard soil. So apparently the act of plunging a knife 10 times into the ground. Now, what does that do, Rabbi say? That removes some part of the external layer of the knife, removing the schmutz. Now, bepashtos, ultimately, again, what that does is that removes anything external. It will not do anything ultimately, again, for internal absorptions, right? So, for example, if you have a knife, if you have a knife, ultimately, again, that was, let's say, used with non-kosher cold items. So it could very well be that plunging it into the earth 10 times will remove what we call shamnunis, external schmutz. Whether or not that actually works, halacha l'maisa, again, for absorptions, different discussion, bepashtos, not. So the Gemara says as follows. Amrav Kana, u'bisakin yafashem bagumos. That's true with a smooth knife that does not have any indentations. Supports this. If you have a smooth knife that does not have any indentations, plunge it into the ground 10 times and you're good to go. So we'll say, so 2 qualifications: virgin soil, which means like hard soil, and number 2, ultimately no indentations in the knife. Here it is. What does that work for? That works for you to use the knife with something cold. Rashi says, right across. Rashi So this is very interesting. So if you have a non-kosher knife and you want to use it, let's say, to cut a loaf of bread, or to cut to cut an apple, you can do that if you what? Plunge it into the ground, virgin soil, hard soil, 10 times. Because what does that effectively do? It removes anything that's on the exterior of the knife. And you're allowed to halacha l'maisa again, then use the knife ultimately again for something cold. But if you want to use the knife for something hot, then what? Hagala. Then you need a formal, normal kosherization process. Rabbi say, listen to how the Gemara ends off here. A great story. Kihad de Mar Yehuda ubati bar Tuvi. Listen to this. Mar Yehuda and Bati bar Yehudi. Now, both say Bati bar Tuvi. 2 Jews, right? Mar Yehuda Bati bar Tuvi were sitting in front of Shavor Malka, King Shapur. Now, King Shapur, Abosai, was Rashi says, Oved Kochavim Haya. He ultimately, again, was a Persian king. Anakum. So Abosai, watch this. Aisulu Kamayo Esroga. So what happened? So they brought for King Shapur an esrog, not for sukkahs, but to eat. Right? They brought from a fruit an esrog. Pasak Achal. Pasak Mahavle Lebati Bartuvi. So what happened? King Shapur took a knife, he cut off a piece of the esrog and he ate it. Then he cut off a piece of the esrog and he gave it to Bati Bartuvi. Okay? Then what did he do? Hadar Datsa Sara Zimni Ba'ara. Pasak Le Lemar Yehuda. He then went ahead and took the knife. King Shapur, listen to this. King Shapur went ahead and took the knife, he plunged it into the ground 10 times, and then cut a piece of an esrog for Mar Yehuda. So King Shapur went ahead and captured the knife and gave it to Mar Yehuda. Amrle Bati Bartuvi v'hogar lav bar Yisraelu. So Bati Bartuvi was a little bit offended. It's like, hey, I'm a Yid too. I'm a Jew too. So why didn't you kasher the knife from me? Abbas is wild. Amrle Mar Kimli Bigave Umar Lo Kimli Bigave. So there are two versions of this story. So ultimately, again, the first version, so King Shapur said to him, listen, Rav Yehuda, I know as being a pious person. You, I don't know you to be a pious person. Rashi says, Markim lebigave Rav Yehuda makir anibo shuparush v'lo yochal davar iser aval b'cha eni mochsach shetei parash l'kach. So King Shapur said essentially to Bati, listen, Rav Yehuda, I know him to be makbid on kashrus. So like, he's not going to eat it if I don't kasher it. You, I don't know, like, well, you ate it, you know. So like, so you, I don't know you to be so frum. I will say, now watch this. Ikidam, alternate version. Let's get ready for this. Amrlei, itkar my avarta beorta. King Shapur says to Bati Bartuvi, I know what you did last night. Now, what does that mean? Rashi points out over my avarta beorta. Derech parsim limsor nashim lachsanim ukisheshigro lem balayla sha'avar kibel Bati Rav Yehuda lo kibel. So apparently, Persian hospitality was that when you were a guest, at least of the king, they would send women to your room. So apparently, Bati Bartuvi didn't say no to the offer. Rav Yehuda did say no to the offer. So King Shapur said, listen, obviously, again, I'm not judging you, right, Bati, right? Bati also quite some hospitality over here, right? So the nice again. So ultimately, King Shapur says, "Listen, Bati, I'm not judging you, but obviously you accepted the hospitality. Rav Yehuda did not. Therefore, Rav Yehuda ultimately clearly is of a higher spiritual caliber." And I will say the story itself is quite dramatic. It's interesting that this is the last story in Maseches Avoda Zara, which is quite fat. Well, now what's the yesod? See, I will say it is important. We've spoken about this many times in the past, and especially Jews have this. You don't see this necessarily in other religions. Jews sometimes feel very uncomfortable, especially in Gullus, right? In Gullus, wearing our faith on our sleeve, right? Again, for whatever the reason, like we're uncomfortable. People are uncomfortable telling their employer about all the Jewish holidays that they need to take, all right? Business lunches, like somehow, again, like I don't know, what should I do? What shouldn't I do? It's less prevalent now, but even wearing a yarmulke, in the workplace, for some reason, Jews are always uncomfortable. And I both say, so much of Maseches Avoda Zara is about keeping ourselves different from general culture. And I think the major takeaway from this story is, if you are a proud Jew, others will come to respect you for who and what you are. If you wear your values and are unapologetic about your values in the eyes of the Akum, in the eyes of society, at the end of the day, you may get asked a million different questions, but a society will respect you more for it. But when you are apologetic about who and what you are, or you try to somehow obscure or hide who and what you are, people won't respect you. If you don't respect your identity, don't expect others to respect your identity. Bati Bartuvi, by the way, Tosas has a whole thing over here that Bati Bartuvi was actually an emancipated slave, and therefore perhaps would have been permitted to be with these women. In other words, Bati Bartuvi, we don't have to even look like he did anything wrong. That's not even it. But in the eyes of King Shapur, Bati Bartuvi, you don't wear your religion on your sleeve, right? You don't come across as a person who's makbid on your Judaic values. Okay, that's fine. Do what you want. I'm not judging you. But if you're not careful with your beliefs, don't expect me to be careful with your beliefs. But Mar Yehuda is a proud Jew. He's a proud Jew. And when a Jew is a proud Jew, the world will never agree with you. The world may never even like you. But the world respects people who respect themselves. And the world respects principled people who lived their lives in consonance with their principles. Even King Shapur was no great tzaddik. Even King Shapur, Sora Mar Yehuda, and ultimately again respected Rabbi. I'll just end off with the following note. The Masechta ends, and save the date. See you, Mimiras Hashem, a week from last night. Sorry for the late notice on this. But Rabbi says this is how the Masechta ends, right? It's Hadron Allah Hasocher Sapoel, Uslika Allah Meseches Avoda Zara. So, right, literally again, we'll return to you. Hasocher Sapoel. That's the name of the parak. Hasocher, and that concludes Meseches Avoda Zara. The Chose of Lublin says something so incredibly beautiful. He says like this. He says, Hadron Allah Hasocher. Hasocher. He says, our avoda in life, like Antigonus says, is not to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately again because of schar, because of reward. Right? Our avoda in life ultimately again is to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu because we have the great privilege to be servants of the Ribono Shel Olam. When we reach that level of service for the sake of service, we create such an incredible infusion of holiness in this world that nothing besides HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be served and will be believed in. And the Rebbe says that's the meaning of these words. Hadron Allah HaSocher. We have to bring to a close the schar. We have to bring to a close this model of worship that's about what we're going to get out of it. And if we're able to bring ourselves to this highest level of HaKadosh, of service of Hashem, not for schar, but just for the sake of service, then what? Slika la meseches avoda zara. Avoda zara will stop to exist in this world when we bring ourselves to the highest level of service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is not service for reward, but service for the sake of service. We've spent the last 75 days, Baruch Hashem, 75 days, literally learning anything and everything about Avoda Zara. And what's the great takeaway message? Whereas all of the Avoda Zaras and all of the Avoda Zaras have simply disappeared into the sands of time. Yet here we are learning about them, but not from them. Here we are learning about them and recognizing Ashreinu Matov Chelkenu Umana Im Goralenu. How fortunate we are to be able each and every day to cling to eternity. This is eternity. Torah is eternity. The Ribono Shel Olam is eternity, which is why thousands of years after this of the Avoda Zara only live on these pages. Yet Rabbi say, we are still here, we are still growing, and we are still dynamic. We should be Zocheh Miras Hashem to continue to use this Masechta as a springboard to see the folly in everything else and the greatness in what we have. And that greatness should bring us closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to bring us to a relationship with Him where we don't serve because of what we're going to get out of it, but serve because we have the privilege to serve, the privilege to connect. And may that connection in Meretz Hashem fuel our journey through our future Masechtas, fuel our journey in the years ahead. Mazel Tov on Maseches Avoda Zara. Harius and Meretz Hashem begins tomorrow. The journey continues, and together Meretz Hashem will continue to serve for the sake of serving, continue to serve in a way that brings us closer, continue to serve in a way that makes us better Jews, better people, better Ovdei Hashem for many years to come. She'ach Habasar.